New Year's Eve, the night when every window should glow with family, when every chair at the table should be filled. But my son looked at me and said, "We're not expecting you." I smiled, picked up my old suitcase, and walked into the cold. 7 days later, I ended the mortgage once and for all. 1 week later, my phone kept buzzing, 22 missed calls from the same person. For the first time in years, I let it ring. If you want to know how it is revealed, please keep listening and give us a thumbs up. The cold of New Year's Eve had a particular bite to it, a wet, creeping chill that promised snow and clung to the fabric of my coat. I stood on the immaculate bluestone walkway leading to my son's house, a home I had never technically owned, but had, in every meaningful way, built for him. From this vantage point, it was a perfect picture of upper-middle-class success. Warm, golden light spilled from the large paned windows, illuminating a meticulously decorated Christmas tree in the living room. It was a scene straight from a holiday catalog, a carefully curated image of familial warmth and prosperity. My suitcase, an old scuffed leather companion from my academic days, felt comically out of place in this pristine environment. I carried a single, modestly wrapped gift, a peace offering that I knew with clinical certainty would be rejected. The house, the light, the entire scene was a stage, and I was an uninvited guest about to miss his cue. I rang the bell, the cheerful melodic chimes echoing the manufactured joy of the season. After a moment, the heavy oak door swung open. Caleb, my son, stood in the doorway. He was dressed in a cashmere sweater the color of oatmeal, his hair perfectly styled, his face a mask of polite, practiced surprise. He did not move to let me in. His body formed a casual yet unmistakable barrier. Behind him, I could see his wife, Samantha, hovering in the grand foyer. She offered a tight, fleeting smile before her eyes darted away, unable to meet my gaze. The air was thick with a tension that the festive decorations could not disguise. It was the sterile, quiet tension of a laboratory right before a critical test is administered. Every detail was being recorded, every micro-expression noted. "Dad," Caleb began, his tone a carefully modulated blend of regret and firmness. "I wasn't sure you were coming." It was a lie, of course. We had discussed my visit weeks ago. This was the opening move in a well-rehearsed script designed to establish his control over the situation from the outset. I offered a placid smile, the kind I had perfected over years of dealing with university deans and ethics committees. "I wouldn't miss it, Caleb," I replied, my voice calm and steady. I made a small motion to step forward, a gentle test of his resolve. He held his ground. The moment stretched, a silent battle of wills fought in the freezing air of his doorstep. The scent of pine from inside the house mingled with the smell of impending snow, a sensory cocktail of false warmth and real cold. Then came the line I had traveled 500 miles to hear, the final data point required to conclude a 35-year experiment. "Actually," he said, the word actually a small, sharp blade, "we're not expecting you for New Year's Eve." He delivered the line with a practiced ease, the culmination of years of carefully nurtured self-interest. I smiled, a genuine academic smile of closure. The hypothesis was confirmed. The subject had failed the final empathy test. I didn't just hear the words. I felt them resonate with the cold, hard certainty of a mathematical proof. The experiment was over. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of profound and utter clarity. New Year's Eve, the night when every window should glow with family, when every chair at the table should be filled. But my son looked at me and said, "We're not expecting you." I smiled, picked up my old suitcase, and walked into the cold. 7 days later, I didn't just end the mortgage. I ended his job, his marriage, his entire reality. 1 week later, my phone kept buzzing. 22 missed calls. For the first time, I felt like the experiment was truly over. If you think this is about a house, you're wrong. This is about a lifelong experiment to answer one question. Can a man be taught empathy? Stick around to see the shocking truth get revealed. I held up the gift. This is for you, from Brenda. The mention of his deceased mother's name was a deliberate, calculated move, a final stimulus to test for any residual empathetic response. A flicker of something, perhaps guilt or annoyance, crossed his face before it was smoothed away. He took the package reluctantly, his fingers brushing against mine. The contact was brief, cold. I nodded once, a gesture of finality, and turned without another word. As I walked back down the bluestone path, the old suitcase feeling surprisingly light in my hand, I reached into my coat pocket. My fingers closed around a small, smooth object. With a practiced, almost casual motion, I placed it on the wide, flat top of the brick gatepost. It was a single, white chess pawn, carved from ivory. It stood there, small and solitary against the darkening sky, a silent declaration that the game had now truly begun. The first motif in a symphony of deconstruction. I did not go to a motel. I went to the presidential suite of the Four Seasons downtown, a room I had booked weeks in advance under a different name. The suite was not chosen for its luxury, but for its utility. It was spacious, secure, and equipped with the high-speed, encrypted internet access my work required. I placed the suitcase on the luggage rack and opened it. There were no clothes inside. It was filled with electronics, a powerful laptop, several encrypted hard drives, a satellite phone, and 3 thick, leather-bound binders. The binders were meticulously labeled Project Caleb, Phase 1, Environment Construction. Project Caleb, Phase 2, Social Integration. Project Caleb, Phase 3, Final Assessment. I removed the laptop and the final binder, placing them on the large mahogany desk overlooking the city. The city lights glittered below like a fallen constellation, a world of oblivious, chaotic humanity. It was a world Caleb had never truly been a part of. His world had been a carefully constructed biosphere, a simulation designed to provide every advantage, to remove every obstacle, to see if a human being, raised in a state of perfect, frictionless comfort, could develop genuine empathy. For 35 years, every aspect of his life had been a variable under my control. His elite private school, his acceptance into an Ivy League university, his high-paying job at a private equity firm, even his beautiful, supportive wife, Samantha, were all elements that I, with the help of my colleague Logan, had designed and implemented. The experiment was ambitious, unethical by most standards, but scientifically pure in its objective. I opened the binder. The pages were filled with notes, charts, and psychological profiles, a lifetime of data. My late wife, Brenda, a brilliant sociologist in her own right, had been the architect of the experiment's core philosophy. She believed that evil, or at least profound selfishness, was not an innate quality, but a product of struggle and scarcity. Her hypothesis was simple. If a child was raised without ever having to compete, to fear, to want for anything, he would grow into a fundamentally good and empathetic man. It was a beautiful, optimistic theory, and for 35 years I had dedicated my life and a considerable fortune to testing it. The result was Caleb, a handsome, successful, charming man who was, at his core, an emotional black hole. A man who could look his own father in the eye on a cold New Year's Eve and turn him away without a second thought, not out of malice, but out of a simple, frictionless inconvenience. I powered on the laptop. The screen came to life, displaying a secure, encrypted interface. I initiated a call. After a few moments, a man's face appeared on the screen. It was Logan, my former university colleague and the logistical mastermind of the entire project. He looked older, his hair grayer than I remembered, but his eyes were still as sharp and analytical as ever. He was in a different time zone, sitting in an office that was as Spartan and functional as my hotel suite. We did not waste time with pleasantries. We were colleagues, not friends. The final test was administered at 1800 hours Eastern Standard Time, I reported, my voice devoid of emotion. The subject's response was negative. The final empathy quotient is 0.02. Logan nodded slowly, his expression grim. He had never fully shared Brenda's optimism. He had been in charge of the control group modeling, running thousands of simulations that predicted this very outcome. The control group was right then, he said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a question. It was a confirmation. I looked out the window at the city below, at the millions of lives unfolding in chaotic, unpredictable patterns. Brenda had wanted to create a better man by giving him a perfect world, but her perfect world had only created a perfect monster. Yes, I said, turning my gaze back to the screen. The subject failed the final empathy test. I took a deep breath, the air in the climate-controlled room feeling cold and thin. I looked at Logan, my partner in this grand, failed endeavor. It's time, I said, the words feeling both heavy and liberating. Initiate reality deconstruction. The deconstruction did not begin with a foreclosure notice or a pink slip. Such methods were crude, external pressures that would give the subject a tangible enemy to fight against. Our approach was more subtle, more insidious. The goal was not to destroy his life from the outside in, but to dismantle his reality from the inside out. We needed to sever his trust in his own perceptions, to make him question the very fabric of his memories. The protocol for this phase, codenamed Gaslight, was designed by a team of cognitive psychologists Logan had on retainer. It was a campaign of systematic psychological erosion, and it began on the first Monday of the new year, less than 48 hours after I had left the white pawn on his gatepost. It began with a painting. Caleb returned home from a day of what he believed was important, world-shaping work to find something amiss. On the wall above the marble fireplace in his living room, where a large, abstract oil painting by a fashionable modern artist had hung for the past 2 years, there was now a cheap, mass-produced print of a Parisian street scene. It was the kind of art one might find in the clearance aisle at a home goods store. He stopped in the foyer, his briefcase still in hand, a deep frown creasing his brow. He called out for Samantha. She emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron, the picture of domesticity. He pointed to the wall. "What is that?" he asked, his voice tight with annoyance. "What happened to the painting?" Samantha looked at the wall, then back at him, her expression a masterclass in feigned confusion. It was a performance she had rehearsed with me via encrypted video calls for weeks. "What are you talking about, honey?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "That's always been there. We bought it at that street fair in the city, remember? You said it reminded you of our honeymoon." She sold the lie with a gentle, reassuring smile. Caleb stared at her, then back at the cheap print. He had a perfect photographic memory for their finances. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he had authorized a payment of $17,000 for the original painting. He had no memory of any street fair. He felt a disorienting lurch in his stomach, the first tremor in the foundations of his world. He was certain he was right, but her conviction was absolute. It was his word against hers, his memory against their shared history. For the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt in his own mind. The next day, the assault on his memory continued. He was in his home office, searching for a tax document from the previous year. He opened a drawer in his filing cabinet and pulled out a photo album he hadn't looked at in years. It was filled with pictures from his childhood. He flipped through the plastic pages, a faint sense of nostalgia giving way to a rising tide of unease. There he was, a small boy with a toothy grin, standing on a beach. But the man standing next to him, with an arm slung around his shoulder, was not me. It was a stranger, a man with a thick mustache and kind, crinkling eyes. He frantically turned the pages. In picture after picture, this same man appeared. At his 10th birthday party, at his middle school graduation, on a fishing trip. I was nowhere to be seen. It was as if I had been surgically removed from his history and replaced by this imposter. He confronted Samantha, shoving the album into her hands. "Who is this man?" he demanded, his voice shaking. She looked at the photos, her brow furrowed in that same practiced look of concern. "Caleb, that's your Uncle Robert," she said softly, as if explaining something to a child. "He was your legal guardian for a few years after your mother passed. He lived with you. Don't you remember him at all?" She delivered the lines perfectly. The name, the backstory, it was all part of the meticulously crafted new narrative. Caleb had no Uncle Robert. He had no memory of anyone but me after Brenda's death. Yet here was the photographic evidence, a tangible contradiction to his entire life's story. He felt a wave of vertigo, his own memories becoming thin and unreliable, like old, fading photographs. The psychological warfare escalated throughout the week. One morning, his key fob wouldn't unlock his silver BMW. Samantha, ever helpful, produced a different fob from a drawer in the kitchen. "You must have grabbed my spare set by mistake," she said with a shrug. But when he got into the car, the custom cream leather interior he had specifically ordered was now a standard factory black. He sat in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel, his heart pounding. Was he losing his mind? Was he having some sort of breakdown? He had a vague, unsettling memory of a conversation with Samantha, where she had tried to convince him that black leather was more practical. Had he agreed? He couldn't be sure anymore. The world was subtly, terrifyingly reshaping itself around him, and he was the only one who seemed to notice. This systematic erosion of his sanity was all being managed from my suite at the Four Seasons. Each incident was a carefully orchestrated move in a much larger game. I had a team of operatives, former intelligence agents sourced by Logan, who were executing the physical swaps. They could bypass any security system, entering and exiting the house like ghosts, their movements precise and untraceable. Samantha was my asset on the inside, the final crucial piece of the puzzle. She would report Caleb's reactions in real time, allowing me to calibrate the next phase of the protocol. I sat at my desk, watching the data streams, reading the psychological assessments, and felt the cold, detached satisfaction of a scientist watching his experiment proceed exactly as planned. My son was not just being punished. He was being methodically, clinically deconstructed. The final move of the week was scheduled for Saturday night. It was designed to be the breaking point, the event that would shatter his last remaining faith in his own sanity and drive him to seek an external anchor, to seek me. My team had planted a series of micro cameras throughout his house weeks ago, their feeds monitored from a secure server. At precisely 3:14 a.m., when his sleep cycle was at its deepest, a single camera in his bedroom was activated. It recorded 60 seconds of footage. Caleb, sleeping soundly in his bed, the rise and fall of his chest the only movement in the silent room. It was mundane, unremarkable, and utterly terrifying in its implication. It was proof that his sanctuary had been breached, that he was being watched, even in his most vulnerable moments. Later that evening, as he sat alone in his home office, trying to reconcile the conflicting realities of his life, his laptop pinged with a new email notification. The sender was an anonymous, encrypted address. The subject line was blank. He hesitated for a moment, a sense of deep foreboding washing over him, before he finally clicked it open. The email contained no text. There was only a single, embedded video link. He clicked it. The 60-second video from the previous night filled his screen. He watched himself sleeping, a voyeur to his own unconsciousness. The blood drained from his face. This was not a faulty memory or a misplaced object. This was an invasion. This was a direct, unmistakable threat. This was proof that he was not going crazy. Something was being done to him. And in that moment of pure, unadulterated terror, he did the only thing he could think of. He grabbed his phone and called the one person he believed was outside the sphere of this encroaching madness. He called me. His first call went to voicemail, and the second, and the third. He called 22 times in the span of 5 minutes, his panic escalating with each unanswered ring. My phone, sitting on the desk beside me, buzzed silently, the screen lighting up with his name again and again. I let it ring. I let him stew in his own terror for a full day. It was a calculated delay, designed to amplify his desperation and make him more receptive to the narrative I was about to construct for him. When I finally agreed to meet, I did not choose a comfortable restaurant or a quiet coffee shop. I sent him the address of a derelict warehouse in the industrial district south of the city, a place of rust and decay, far removed from the polished comfort of his simulated life. The location itself was a message. You are no longer in the world, you know. He arrived looking like a man who hadn't slept in a week. His expensive clothes were rumpled, his hair was unkempt, and his eyes were wide with a frantic, hunted look. He was a king who had been violently ejected from his castle, and he was completely unprepared for the wilderness. He rushed towards me as soon as I stepped out of my car, his voice a torrent of panicked accusations. He spoke of the painting, the photographs, the car, and finally, the video. He was convinced there was a conspiracy, a plot to drive him insane, and he looked at me with the desperate hope of a child seeking protection from a monster under the bed. He believed I was his ally, his one fixed point in a world that had become fluid and treacherous. I listened patiently, my expression a carefully crafted mask of paternal concern, letting him exhaust his panic until all that was left was a raw, quivering fear. This was the state I needed him in. He had to be broken down before he could be rebuilt according to the new design. I led him inside the warehouse. The cavernous space was empty except for a single table and 2 chairs, positioned directly under a bare, hanging light bulb. It felt like an interrogation room. I had him sit, and I opened my laptop on the table between us. I did not immediately address his fears. Instead, I began to speak about his career. I spoke of the private equity firm he worked for, a company called Sterling Financial. I spoke of the incredible success he had achieved in such a short time, the multi-million-dollar deals he had closed, the reputation he had built as a brilliant, ruthless prodigy. I recited his accomplishments like a proud father, each word a testament to the perfect life we had built for him. He listened, his confusion growing. He didn't understand what this had to do with the video of him sleeping. Then, with a few keystrokes, I changed the narrative completely. I showed him documents, incorporation papers for Sterling Financial, dated a month before he had even graduated from college, bank statements from a labyrinth of offshore accounts, showing a steady flow of capital into the firm. I showed him a flow chart, a complex web of shell corporations and holding companies that all led back to a single, central entity, a research foundation established by his mother, Brenda, 30 years ago. I explained, in a calm, academic tone, that his company was not a real company. It was a stage, a meticulously designed simulation created for the sole purpose of providing him with a frictionless path to success. His colleagues were not colleagues. They were carefully selected actors. His deals were not real. They were scripted events with predetermined outcomes. He stared at the screen, his face a mask of disbelief. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, that's impossible. I was there. I did the work." He began to recount a specific deal, a complex acquisition he had orchestrated a few years prior, a deal that had cemented his reputation. He remembered the long nights, the brutal negotiations, the thrill of the final victory. His memory of it was vivid, real. I listened patiently until he was finished. Then, with a single click, I played a video on the laptop. It was a recording from a hidden camera in the boardroom during those very negotiations. It showed the CEO of the rival company, a man Caleb had viewed as a formidable adversary, taking a phone call in the hallway during a break. I turned up the volume. The CEO's voice was clear. "Yes, Mr. Logan," he was saying. "Understood. I'll reject the next offer and push for the final number. We're right on schedule." The blood drained from Caleb's face. The memory he had cherished as his greatest professional triumph was a lie, a piece of theater performed for his benefit. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, searching for some sign that this was a cruel joke. I offered him none. I continued the deconstruction, moving from his professional life to his social life. I showed him background dossiers on his closest friends. His college roommate, the best man at his wedding, was a psychology graduate student whose dissertation was a longitudinal study on a single, isolated subject. His golfing buddies were former federal agents, experts in surveillance and social engineering. Every significant relationship in his life had been a transaction, every friend a paid observer. He was beginning to crumble, his psychological defenses eroding under the relentless assault of the truth. But he still clung to one last pillar of his reality, his mother. "My mother would never have been a part of this," he said, his voice cracking. "She loved me." It was the desperate cry of a man trying to find solid ground in a world that had turned to quicksand. I met his gaze, my expression unchanging. "You're right," I said. "She wasn't a part of this. She was the architect of it." I then revealed the core of the experiment. Brenda's hypothesis that a life without struggle would create a man of perfect empathy. I framed it as a noble, if misguided, scientific endeavor, a mother's desperate attempt to build a better world by building a better son. He recoiled as if I had struck him. The idea that his mother's love was not a source of comfort, but the very foundation of his prison was a blow from which he could not recover. He began to hyperventilate, his mind unable to process the sheer scale of the deception. He stood up, knocking his chair over, and backed away from the table. He called me a monster, a liar, and insane. He accused me of fabricating everything, of being the one who had truly lost his mind after Brenda's death. He shouted that he was going to leave, that he was going to call the police, that he was going to have me committed. He was a cornered animal, lashing out with the last of his strength. I did not react to his outburst. I simply watched him, my expression one of calm, detached pity. His reaction was predictable, a textbook case of cognitive dissonance. The subject's mind, unable to reconcile its lived experience with the new, contradictory information, was defaulting to denial and aggression. It was a normal, expected part of the process. I let him rage until his energy was spent, until he was leaning against a cold brick pillar, his chest heaving. I waited for the silence to settle back into the vast, empty space of the warehouse. His anger was gone, replaced by a hollow, desolate despair. He was a man who had lost everything, including his own past. When I finally spoke, my voice was quiet, almost gentle. I did not try to convince him further. I did not show him any more evidence. I simply planted a single, final seed of doubt, a new avenue for him to explore, a new thread for him to pull that I knew would unravel the last remaining piece of his fabricated world. "You may be right, Caleb," I said, closing the laptop. "Perhaps I have lost my mind. Perhaps this is all a delusion, an old man's fantasy." I stood up and walked towards the exit, pausing at the door to look back at him. "But if that's the case," I continued, my voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space, "then you should ask the one person you still trust, the person who shares your bed every night." I held his gaze. "Go home and ask your loving wife, Samantha. Ask her about contract ND84. He drove home in a state of fugue, the city lights blurring into abstract streaks of color through his windshield. The warehouse, the laptop, my final words, they all swirled in his mind. A toxic cocktail of disbelief and a horrifying, creeping sense of truth. He was clinging to one last, desperate hope. That this was all a monstrous, elaborate lie concocted by a grieving, unhinged old man. I was the one who was sick, not him. My story was too fantastic, too diabolical to be real. Samantha would confirm it. She would hold him, tell him I had finally gone mad, and they would deal with me together. She was his anchor, the one part of his life that felt undeniably real and true. He parked the car haphazardly in the driveway and burst into the house, calling her name. She met him in the foyer, her face etched with a convincing performance of wifely concern. "Caleb, my God, what happened? Where have you been?" she asked, rushing to his side. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip tighter than he intended. He looked directly into her eyes, searching for the truth. "It's my father," he said, his voice ragged. "He's lost his mind. He's saying my whole life is a lie, that my company is fake, that my friends are actors, that we—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He needed her to say it for him, to deny the insane accusation and bring him back from the brink. He needed her to be his wife, not a character in my twisted play. Samantha's performance was, I had to admit, flawless. She played her role to perfection. She held his face in her hands, her expression a symphony of love and worry. She assured him that I was a sick old man, that the grief over Brenda had finally broken me. She suggested they call a doctor, that they look into getting me professional help. Every word was designed to soothe him, to reinforce his belief in our shared reality. She was leading him back from the edge, gently guiding him back into the safety of the simulation. For a moment, it seemed to be working. The wild, hunted look in his eyes began to soften. The tension in his shoulders eased. He was ready to believe her. He wanted to believe her. And then he remembered my final words, the name of the contract. He pulled back slightly, his eyes narrowing. "He said something else," Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous. "He told me to ask you about a contract, ND84. The change in her was instantaneous and profound. It was not a dramatic gasp or a sudden pallor. It was something far more subtle and damning. A flicker in her eyes, a momentary, almost imperceptible stiffening of her posture. The flawless mask of the concerned wife slipped for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. In that split second of hesitation, Caleb saw the truth. He saw the actress, not the wife. The carefully constructed reality he had been clinging to shattered into a million pieces. Her recovery was quick, but the damage was done. She tried to dismiss it, to laugh it off as more of my nonsense, but the conviction was gone from her voice. The foundation of their relationship, trust, had been vaporized in that single, silent moment of recognition. Caleb stepped back from her, a look of utter devastation on his face. The betrayal was no longer an abstract concept presented on a laptop screen in a dusty warehouse. It was here, in his home, looking at him with the eyes of the woman he loved. It was real. "Who are you?" he whispered, the question not one of identity, but of existence. It was in that moment of pure, raw confrontation that the front door opened. I walked in, followed closely by Logan. I had timed our entrance perfectly, arriving at the precise moment of maximum emotional distress. Samantha flinched as if she had been struck. She looked at me, her eyes wide with panic. She had failed. The subject was off script, and she had lost control. I ignored her completely. My focus was entirely on Caleb. Logan, ever the professional, remained by the door, a silent observer holding a tablet. He was recording everything, capturing the raw data of a complete psychological collapse. The scene was set for the first public humiliation, a controlled demolition of what was left of my son's identity. The audience was small, just me, Logan, and the woman who had shared his bed. But for Caleb, it was the entire world. "It seems you've been having an interesting conversation," I said, my voice calm and conversational as I strolled into the living room. I gestured for Caleb to join me, as if we were about to discuss the weather. He was paralyzed, caught between the woman who had betrayed him and the man who had orchestrated it all. Samantha began to stammer an apology, a desperate attempt to regain control, to explain, but I cut her off with a cold, dismissive glance. "That won't be necessary, Ms. Gable," I said, using her real surname for the first time in his presence. The use of her family name was another small, calculated cut, severing her connection to the role of his wife. The final piece of evidence was not a document or a video. It was a person. On a signal from me, Logan opened the door again. An older couple, a man and a woman in their late 60s, walked in. They looked like ordinary, middle-class people, their faces etched with a mixture of nervousness and resignation. Caleb stared at them, having no idea who they were. I made the introduction. "Caleb," I said, my voice resonating in the silent room. "I'd like you to meet Mr. and Mrs. Gable. They are Samantha's parents." The couple gave Caleb a weak, apologetic smile. Samantha looked at them, then at Caleb, and something inside her finally broke. The pressure of the lie, the weight of the performance, the genuine, unexpected pain she saw in Caleb's eyes. It all became too much. She was a research assistant, not a sociopath. She had been trained to observe and report, not to actively participate in the vivisection of a human soul. She let out a choked sob, a sound of pure, unscripted agony. "I'm sorry, Caleb," she cried, the words tumbling out between gasps. "He's right. All of it. It's all true. I was hired. It was a job. I'm so sorry." Her confession was not part of the plan. My intention was to dismantle his reality piece by piece, with me as the sole narrator. Her emotional breakdown was an unforeseen variable, but it was also far more effective. Her tears were more damning than any contract I could have produced. Caleb did not look at her. He did not look at me. He stared at the Gables, the two strangers who were his in-laws, people he should have known for years, and he saw in their awkward, pitying faces the final, irrefutable proof of his hollow life. He made a sound, a low, guttural noise of pure, primal pain. It was the sound of a mind breaking, of a soul being torn apart. He did not lash out. He did not scream at me or attack me. His reaction was far more troubling. He turned, his movements stiff and robotic, and walked towards the front door. He moved past Logan, past the Gables, past me. He opened the door and stepped out into the cold night. Then, with a scream that seemed to tear from the very depths of his being, a raw, animalistic cry of absolute despair, he began to run. He ran out into the perfect, manicured street of his perfect, artificial neighborhood, a man with no past, no present, and no future. I turned to Logan, my expression unreadable. "He's running," I said, a statement of simple observation. "If nothing is real, let's see where he runs to." He ran with no destination, propelled only by the explosive force of his shattered life. The perfect suburban night, once a source of comfort and pride, had become a labyrinth of menacing facades. Each glowing window was a hollow eye, each manicured lawn a sterile green plate. The air itself felt different, thin and artificial, lacking the chaotic, living sense of a real neighborhood. His mind, stripped of all its familiar anchors, began to perceive the world with a terrifying new clarity. He was no longer just a resident. He was an anomaly, a rogue element moving through a system that was suddenly showing its seams. He saw things he had never noticed before, or rather things his programming had trained him to ignore. The rhythmic, metronomic squeak of a neighbor's porch swing, a sound he had heard 1,000 times, now seemed unnervingly perfect, a sound loop playing on repeat. There was no variation in its cadence, no human inconsistency. It was the sound of a machine imitating life. His frantic pace slowed to a staggered walk as more glitches began to appear in his peripheral vision. A man across the street, Mr. Henderson, was meticulously trimming his hedges under the amber glow of a street lamp. But his movements were wrong. He performed the same precise 3-foot sweep with his electric trimmer, paused, and then repeated the exact same motion. Sweep, pause, sweep, pause. It was a perfect, unbroken loop of suburban diligence, a piece of background animation designed to give the illusion of a living neighborhood. Caleb stopped, his breath catching in his throat, and watched for a full minute. The man never deviated. He never wiped his brow, never adjusted his grip, never stepped back to admire his work. He was a piece of scenery, as inanimate as the plastic flamingo stuck in the lawn beside him. A cold, existential dread, far deeper than the shock of betrayal, began to seep into Caleb's bones. He wasn't just being lied to. He was inhabiting a lie. He looked up, desperate for something real, something vast and uncontrollable to anchor himself to. But the sky was wrong. A breathtaking sunset was painted across the horizon, a spectacular wash of violet and orange. Yet it was unnervingly static. The clouds, perfect and wispy, did not drift. The colors did not fade or deepen. It was a photograph, a matte painting of a sunset, beautiful and utterly dead. There were no stars. He had lived here for years and had never consciously registered the complete and total absence of stars. The realization was a quiet, internal scream. He was in a box, a beautiful, meticulously crafted box, but a box nonetheless. He started running again, this time with a purpose. He ran towards the edge of the illusion, towards the painted sunset, driven by a primal need to touch the walls of his prison. He ran past the looping neighbors and the perfect houses, the sound of his own ragged breathing the only real thing in this synthetic world. The street he was on, Meadowood Lane, was supposed to curve gently and merge with the main access road that led to the highway. He knew this route as well as he knew his own name. It was the path he took to work every morning. But as he sprinted towards the familiar bend, the world in front of him began to flatten, the perspective shifting in a way that defied physics. The gentle curve was an illusion of forced perspective. The road did not bend. It ended. He didn't have time to stop. His forward momentum carried him across the last few feet of perfect asphalt, and he collided not with the open air of a continuing road, but with something solid, unyielding, and cold. The impact knocked the wind out of him, sending a jarring shockwave through his entire body. He fell back, landing hard on the pavement, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and pain. He looked up, and his sanity finally, irrevocably, snapped. He had run into the sky. Before him stood a colossal metal wall, stretching up into the artificial twilight, so vast it dwarfed everything around it. It was painted with the photorealistic image of the sunset and the distant, tree-lined horizon. The paint job was flawless, but up close he could see the faint texture of the metal, the subtle imperfections of the artist's brushstrokes. A few feet from the ground, a small, peeling section of paint revealed the dull, gray steel beneath. He scrambled to his feet and pressed his hands against the surface. It was cold, real, and utterly impassable. He was a fly trapped in a jar, and he had just found the glass. He followed the wall, his steps now a slow, shuffling gait of a man in deep shock. He saw the truth of his world. The houses were not homes, but elaborate three-sided sets. The lush green trees were made of plastic and steel. The entire neighborhood was a stage. And then the lights came on. Not the warm, gentle street lights, but a series of blinding, industrial floodlights mounted on unseen gantries high above. The artificial dusk was instantly obliterated, washed out by a harsh, shadowless white light that bleached all the color from the world. The painted sky became a glaring, overexposed backdrop. The cozy suburban homes were revealed for what they were, empty shells of wood and plaster. The illusion was not just broken, it was being brutally, systematically dismantled. Disembodied voices, clipped and professional, echoed through the vast space, amplified by an unseen PA system. Kill the ambient sound loop. Stand by on cameras 3 and 5. We have the subject centered. Cue the primary platform. Caleb stood frozen in the center of the sudden, sterile brightness, exposed and utterly alone. He was no longer a resident. He was a specimen under a microscope. A low humming sound started from above, and a section of the painted sky began to descend. It was a metal platform, a gantry, lowering slowly and smoothly on hydraulic arms. 2 figures stood on it, silhouetted against the powerful lights behind them. They looked down on him, not with anger or malice, but with the detached curiosity of observers. As the platform descended, their features became clear. It was me, and beside me, holding a tablet, was Logan. All around the perimeter of the vast sound stage, he could now see them, the audience. Dozens of people in dark clothing, technicians and crew members, stood silently by their equipment, their faces pale and anonymous in the harsh light. Cameras, large and black like the eyes of giant insects, swiveled on their tripods to focus on him. He was the center of a universe he never knew existed, the unwitting protagonist in a show that was, apparently, reaching its finale. The platform came to a stop about 30 feet above the ground, positioning us in a place of undeniable authority. My voice, when it came, was not the familiar paternal tone he knew. It was amplified, disembodied, and perfectly calm, the voice of a lecturer addressing a crowded hall. "Congratulations, Caleb," the voice boomed, echoing off the metal walls of his world. "You have reached the end of the simulation." There was no emotion in the words, just a statement of fact. This was not a confrontation. It was a debriefing. He stared up at me, his mind too fractured to form a coherent response. The betrayal was so total, so absolute, that it transcended anger or hatred. It was a new kind of emotion, a feeling for which there was no name. He had been born and raised in a cage, and the man he called his father was the zookeeper. He had been observed, tested, and manipulated from his very first breath. I allowed the silence to stretch, to let the full weight of the revelation settle upon him. I let him see the cameras, the crew, the sheer, breathtaking scale of the artifice that had been his life. I wanted him to understand the completeness of his powerlessness, the fact that every choice he had ever made had been within a set of predetermined parameters. When I spoke again, it was to present the final variable of the experiment. I raised my arm and pointed to the massive wall behind him. 2 sections of the wall began to slide open, revealing 2 identical, full-sized doors, about 50 yards apart. They were stark and unadorned. Simple rectangular openings in the fabric of his fake world. You have demonstrated an inability to develop organic empathy within a controlled environment of optimal conditions, my amplified voice declared. The initial hypothesis has been proven false. We are, therefore, moving to the final stage. The test of choice. I described the options with the dispassionate clarity of a game show host explaining the rules. The first door, I explained, was door A. Behind door A, the simulation will be reset. The events of the past week will be chemically erased from your memory. You will be reintegrated into your life exactly as it was. You will have your job, your home, your wife. A subtle emphasis on the last word. Samantha will be offered a new, more lucrative contract to continue her role. You will return to a state of blissful ignorance. You will be, by all metrics, happy. The offer was monstrous in its simplicity. A return to the comfortable lie, a voluntary reinsertion into the matrix. It was a choice to stop knowing, to value comfort over truth. Then I gestured to the other opening. Behind door B is the exit, the real world. It is chaotic, unpredictable, and often cruel. You will have nothing. The identity you know, Caleb, is a construct owned by this project. Your bank accounts are not real. Your social security number is a fabrication. You will walk through that door as a non-person, with no history, no resources, and no name. You will be a blank slate, a true unknown. You will be free, but you will be nothing. It was a choice between a comfortable, curated heaven and a brutally honest, unpredictable hell. It was the choice between being a pampered king in a play or a nameless beggar in the real world. I let the 2 options hang in the sterile, silent air of the soundstage. The cameras were all focused on him, capturing every flicker of emotion on his face. The entire production, his entire life, had led to this single moment, this one, impossible decision. I leaned forward slightly, my hands gripping the railing of the gantry. The final act was his alone. He stood in the center of the world that had been built for him, a world that was now being offered to him again, a gilded cage with an open door. He looked from the promise of door A to the terrifying void of door B. He looked at the faces of the crew, the silent, anonymous arbiters of his fate. He looked at Samantha, who was now standing near the edge of the set, a small, broken figure in the vastness of the stage, her face a mask of tears and shame. Finally, he looked back up at me, the architect of his existence, the father who had been his god and his devil. The experiment was no longer about empathy. It was about the very nature of the human soul. I gave him the final push, my voice echoing one last time across his shattered reality. So, you must choose, Caleb, I said, the words falling like stones into the silence. Fabricated happiness or authentic pain? He stood in the center of the stage, a solitary figure bathed in the unforgiving glare of the floodlights. The world had been stripped down to its essential components: a man, a choice, and an audience. The amplified echo of my final question, fabricated happiness or authentic pain, hung in the sterile air, a philosophical query posed as a death sentence. He did not look at me. His gaze was turned inward, navigating the smoking ruins of his own mind. The anger had passed. The terror had subsided. What remained was a stillness, a profound and terrifying emptiness. He was a character who had just read the script of his own life and discovered he was nothing but a pawn in someone else's story. Every memory, every triumph, every love had been a carefully crafted illusion. He was not a person. He was a collection of responses to stimuli, a data set. And now, the data set was being asked to choose its own fate. His eyes drifted towards door A. I could almost see the simulation playing out in his mind, the blissful chemical amnesia, the gentle reinsertion into his comfortable life. He would wake up in his own bed, the events of the past week a forgotten nightmare. Samantha would be there, her smile as warm and convincing as ever. He would go to work, close deals, and earn commissions that felt real. He would drink expensive wine and drive a fast car, and believe with every fiber of his being that he was the master of his own destiny. It was a seductive offer. It was the promise of a life without the crushing weight of this new, unbearable knowledge. It was a return to the garden, a chance to uneat the fruit of the tree of knowledge. It was a lie, but it was a beautiful one, and a part of him, the part that was exhausted and broken, craved it more than anything. Then his gaze shifted to door B. It offered nothing. It was not a door to a new life, but an abyss. To walk through it was to commit a form of suicide, to kill the person known as Caleb, and step out into the world as a ghost. He would be nameless, penniless, a non-entity in a world that valued identity and wealth above all else. He would face starvation, exposure, the brutal indifference of a society that had no record of his existence. It was not a choice between a good life and a bad life. It was a choice between a life that was a comfortable lie and a death that was painfully, terrifyingly real. This was the true test. Would the subject choose the security of the cage, even after knowing it was a cage? Or would he choose the terrifying, absolute freedom of the void, even if it meant his own destruction? The experiment was no longer about empathy. It had evolved into a raw test of the human spirit's capacity for truth. He looked at Samantha. She stood near the edge of the massive set, a small, solitary figure dwarfed by the scale of the production. She was no longer crying. Her face was pale, her expression one of profound shame and regret. She was watching him, her hands clasped in front of her, a spectator at the trial of a man she had helped condemn. Their eyes met across the brightly lit expanse. In her gaze, he saw not the research assistant, not the paid actress, but a fellow prisoner. She was as trapped in this experiment as he was, bound by contracts and choices made long ago. Her betrayal was unforgivable, a wound that would never heal. But in that shared moment of utter ruin, a new, different kind of connection was forged. It was not love. It was the silent, grim acknowledgement of two souls sharing the same circle of hell. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a silent plea for him to not choose her, to not choose the lie they had built together. That single, honest gesture seemed to finalize his decision. He broke eye contact with her and looked back up at the gantry, directly at me. For the first time since he had entered the warehouse, his expression was clear. The confusion and terror were gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. It was not defiance. It was acceptance. He had accepted the premise. He had accepted the terms. He had accepted the monstrous truth of his own existence. He would not be my data point any longer. He turned his back on door A, the door that led back to his gilded cage, back to the life I had so generously offered to restore for him. He squared his shoulders and began the long walk across the concrete floor towards door B. Each step was deliberate, measured, the sound of his shoes echoing in the vast, silent sound stage. He was not running towards freedom. He was walking towards his own execution. As he walked, a new energy filled the space. The silent crew members stirred, their professional detachment momentarily broken. Murmurs rippled through the audience of technicians. This was not the expected outcome. The projections, the psychological models, had all indicated that the subject, when faced with total annihilation, would retreat to the safety of the known variable. He was supposed to choose the simulation. He was supposed to choose happiness. His slow, deliberate march towards oblivion was an anomaly, a rogue data point that threatened the integrity of the entire experiment. Logan, standing beside me, shifted his weight, his fingers tapping nervously on the screen of his tablet. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of scientific frustration and something else, something that might have been respect. I remained perfectly still, my eyes fixed on my son. I felt nothing. This was simply the next phase. Caleb reached door B and placed his hand on the cold, flat surface of the metal. He did not hesitate. He did not look back. He was ready. But just as he began to push, a voice cried out. A single word cutting through the tense silence. "Wait!" It was Samantha. All eyes, human and camera, swiveled to her. She was running, stumbling across the uneven floor of the set, her movements clumsy and desperate. She was no longer a research assistant. She was no longer an actress. She was a woman breaking every rule in her contract, a variable that had just gone completely off script. She ran past the cameras, past the stunned crew, her eyes locked on Caleb's back. She wasn't running to stop him, to pull him back into the lie. She was running to join him. She reached him, breathless, and stood beside him at the threshold of the abyss. She did not look at Caleb. She looked up at the gantry, her gaze finding mine, and for the first time, there was no fear in her eyes. There was only a quiet, burning defiance. She had been a pawn for years, a well-paid, complicit cog in my machine, but the raw human cost of the experiment, laid bare in Caleb's agony, had finally become too much to bear. She had reached her breaking point. She had chosen a side, and it was not mine. "My contract is over," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. It was not a request. It was a declaration of independence. It was the most unpredictable, and therefore the most interesting, thing she had done in a decade. Logan swore under his breath, furiously typing on his tablet, but I raised a hand to stop him. I wanted to see this play out. This was new data. Caleb looked at her, his expression unreadable. He had every reason to hate her, to push her away. She was the living embodiment of his life's great lie. But as he looked at her, standing there, having thrown away her own safety and security to stand with him at the edge of nothing, he saw not the deceiver, but the first and only person to make a real choice on his behalf. He gave a single, curt nod. It was not forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance of a new, unforeseen variable. Together, without another word, they put their shoulders to the heavy metal door and pushed. It opened with a low groan of protesting hinges, not into the bright sunlight of the real world, but into a stark, impenetrable darkness. For a moment, they stood silhouetted against the black void, two figures leaving a world of light and lies for an unknown reality. Then, they stepped through, and the door swung shut behind them with a heavy, final thud. For a moment, the set was silent. The experiment was over. The subject had made his choice. Then, on my command, the floodlights went down, replaced by functional, low-wattage work lights. The crew began to move, their voices now casual and businesslike as they started to break down the set. Logan was speaking rapidly into his headset, coordinating the next phase. Phase 2 complete. Subject and associate have exited the environment. Initiate corridor protocol. Stand by for Phase 3. The magic was gone. It was just a film set again. I turned away from the scene and walked back across the gantry. Samantha's breach of contract was a financial and logistical annoyance, but it was also a fascinating complication. Her emotional contagion had clearly influenced the subject's final decision. It was a variable I would have to account for in future projects. Caleb and Samantha stepped out of one form of darkness and into another. The space beyond the door was not a city street or an open field. It was a long, narrow corridor, painted a sterile, institutional white, and lit by cold, humming fluorescent panels in the ceiling. The air was cool and smelled of antiseptic and recycled air. There were no windows, no doors, only the endless, identical white walls stretching into the distance in both directions. It was another cage, just a different kind of one. They were not free. They had simply been transferred from the habitat to the laboratory. At the far end of the corridor, a figure was waiting for them. It was Logan. He stood with his arms crossed, his expression as neutral and impassive as ever. He was not holding a weapon. He was holding a tablet computer. He waited for them to approach, their footsteps echoing unnervingly in the silent corridor. They stopped a few feet in front of him. Two exhausted, disheveled survivors of a psychological war. Logan did not offer any words of comfort or explanation. He simply handed the tablet to Caleb. On the screen was a single block of text, displayed in a clean, sans serif font. It was a message from me. It read, "Welcome to Phase 3, Reintegration. Your previous identities have been erased. Your objective is to build new ones and prove your viability as functional members of society. You have 6 months. Your first test is to find the exit to this facility. The experiment continues." Caleb read the message, his face expressionless. Then he looked up from the screen, his eyes meeting Logan's. There was no fear left in them. There was no anger. There was only a cold, quiet emptiness. He handed the tablet back to Logan, took Samantha's hand, and started walking down the endless white corridor, away from Logan, away from me, into the heart of the next, more difficult maze. The experiment was far from over. It had just begun. 1 year has passed. The date is December 31st, 2026. I am in a different room now, a different city. This space is not a hotel suite repurposed as a command center. It is a purpose-built observation deck. It is minimalist, sterile, the walls a neutral gray. There is only a single chair, a console, and a wall of high-definition screens. There is no chessboard in this room. The game is no longer an abstraction. The pieces are real, and I watch their movements in real time. My observation is no longer limited to external cameras or field reports. The technology has been upgraded. I see the world through their eyes, a constant first-person feed transmitted from micro-optic implants. One was installed in Caleb at birth, a routine pediatric procedure. The other was administered to Samantha during a mandatory health screening covered by her contract. I see what they see, hear what they hear. I am the ultimate ghost in the machine. On the screens, their life unfolds. It is a brutal, uncurated reality. They live in a cramped third-floor walk-up apartment in a rundown section of a city they did not choose. The plaster is cracked. The heating is unreliable. I watch Caleb spend 10 hours a day on his back on a cold concrete floor, his hands raw and stained with grease, as he works as a mechanic in a small, independent garage. I watch Samantha stack books in a dusty public library, her face a mask of weary patience as she deals with irritable patrons for minimum wage. I see the friction, the exhaustion. I see them argue over a $75 utility bill, their voices sharp with the accumulated stress of a year spent on the brink of financial collapse. I see the raw, unfiltered struggle of two people trying to exist in a world for which they were never prepared. They are no longer subjects in a controlled environment. They are specimens in the wild. But I also see other things, data points that were never present in the pristine simulation of Meadowood. I see Samantha bringing home a day-old newspaper so Caleb can scan the classifieds for a better job. I see him saving half of his sandwich for her when he knows she skipped lunch to cover an extra shift. These are small, insignificant acts of mutual survival, born not of love or affection, but of a shared, traumatic bond. They are two soldiers in the same foxhole, bound together by the war they have both survived. Then, one afternoon in early autumn, I observe a new, significant event. A young boy from the neighborhood brings his bicycle to the garage, the chain hopelessly broken. His mother is with him, her expression worried as she explains she can't afford to pay for the repair until next week. The old Caleb, the Caleb of the simulation, would not have registered this moment. He would have been annoyed by the interruption, dismissive of a problem that offered no financial or social gain. But this new Caleb, the one forged in the crucible of authentic pain, simply nods. He spends his entire lunch break patiently fixing the chain, using a spare part he pays for out of his own pocket. He shows the boy how to oil it, his voice quiet and steady. When he is finished, the mother thanks him, promising again to pay him next week. He just waves her off. "Don't worry about it," he says. He is not performing for an audience. He does not know he has one. It is a moment of pure, uncalculated empathy, a variable I had failed to produce with a lifetime of comfort, now emerging organically from a foundation of suffering. In that moment, I feel a sense of profound clinical satisfaction. The original hypothesis was wrong, but the experiment, in its failure, has yielded a far more interesting result. Brenda believed that comfort would breed empathy. She was incorrect. It seems the opposite is true. Empathy is a survival mechanism, a muscle that strengthens only through the repeated stress of shared hardship. The pawn had not just crossed the board and become a queen. The pawn had been melted down in a furnace and reforged into something else entirely, something stronger, something real. But science does not end with a single, successful result. A successful experiment only opens the door to new, more complex questions. A new hypothesis begins to form in my mind, a logical and necessary extension of the current findings. I lean forward in my chair, my fingers poised over the console. The new question is this: can an empathetic response, forged and conditioned by a year of sustained adversity, survive the sudden and overwhelming reintroduction of comfort and security? Is this new trait a permanent adaptation, or is it a temporary state, contingent on the external pressure of their environment? The question demands an answer. It requires a new test, a new variable. I access a secure financial account, one of several established for the project's long-term operational costs. I type in a series of commands, my fingers moving quickly and precisely. I authorize a transfer, a significant one. In the small, run-down apartment I am watching through their eyes, a thin envelope slides under the front door. I watch as Caleb comes home, exhausted and covered in grime. I watch as he sees the envelope on the worn linoleum floor. I watch through his eyes as he picks it up. It has no return address. Inside is a single piece of paper. It is a cashier's check for $1 million. There is no name on the sender line. It is an anonymous, untraceable gift from the universe. I watch his face, reflected in the small mirror by the door, as his expression shifts from confusion to disbelief, to a dawning, terrifying hope. Samantha comes out of the kitchen, and I see the same sequence of emotions play out on her face. They are saved. Their suffering is over. I lean back in my chair, my eyes fixed on the multiple feeds, observing every nuance of their reactions. The old experiment is over. The new one has just begun. Thank you for listening to my story. What would you do if you were in my position? Please feel free to share your thoughts below.